2018 Stanford study found that over 50% of primary care physicians believe that the EHR needs an overhaul. This critical piece of software that doctors use every day is difficult to overhaul because of the sheer amount of information that they have to process within it. It's extremely difficult to design navigation patterns that allow doctors to find whatever information they need depending on their workflow. I have been thinking about how a smarter UX could enable doctors to find anything they need. There are very few existing navigation patterns out there that I think could support the complexity and quantity and quality of data that a doctor needs to search through. So I've had to look for inspiration outside the box and return to some UX basics in order to devise a system that I think can solve this problem. Today, I want to walk you through a couple of these options. Now, before we get too far into that, let me show you a little bit about what the system is. The system is called healthcareOS, and it's comprised of these modules. So instead of each one of these pieces of information being a separate page or a section on a page, these are modules that the doctor can kind of add or remove as they need to, depending on what kind of patient or the context that they're working in. Now, the challenge with this is that these modules, well, there's a lot of them. This is a non-exhaustive list of all of these modules, and there are, even in this list, there's a lot of potential options, particularly when you start thinking about people having multiple prescriptions, multiple conditions, lots of past appointments, different vital signs, different documents, different scans. There's just so much that a physician might need to look at. But I think there's something important here. While these objects are the core things that a user is going to interact with, they actually are related to what I call the primitives. And these are essentially the kind of main objects that the system exists to serve. Patients, appointments, and messages, and kind of orders as well, although that one's a little bit different. Basically, what they are is the patient's appointments and messages are essentially the things that without them, the system does not make sense. It does not exist without those things. And so those are essentially the top level of thing that a user is going to interact with. And everything else is kind of just a piece of that. It's just a piece of that puzzle, essentially. So when it comes to designing a system to allow a physician or a user to get into a primitive, a patient or appointment, and then find any piece of information they need within that, we begin to get into a system that is a little bit difficult to kind of figure out. It's a little challenging to figure out how do we give them the flexibility to do that and navigate, but also give them the kind of the confidence about like where they are within the system itself. Because it could be so open and so kind of flexible that it would almost be a challenge to use. It's similar to whiteboarding tools like FigJam or Whimsical or Miro, where when you start a whiteboarding tool session, you just start a blank page, it's so open that you kind of like get paralyzed because you're not sure exactly what to do. And I've actually seen that happen in user testing in tools similar, where you give the user a blank canvas and they're like, I don't know where to start. And this is a similar problem. Where do you start? And then more importantly, how do you get back to where you started, or how do you continue on in your journey once you kind of get an idea of where you're going? Let me clarify this a little bit. This is what I'm talking about. Whenever a physician is working with a patient or an appointment, because that's one of the more common things that this will be facilitating, they're going to have a primitive, and that's going to be the appointment and pretty much the patient basically that they're working with. Now, within that primitive, there are a series of objects that they can interact with. And these objects also have nested objects. So there could be an appointment list, a medication list. There could be a medication detail. Those are related. Could be a condition with a medication related to it, right? So we now have a series of objects and nested objects that the user needs to work with. And they need a way to find and add these modules to the screen. They need to parse and understand these modules, and they need to connect these modules to the parent primitive. Basically, this is not something they are doing, but it's something that needs to be done for them. There needs to be this cognitive connection between what they're doing, which is seeing a patient, and the information that they're working with, and they need to understand what that relationship is to the next step. Generally speaking, in this context, it's going to be writing a note, creating documentation, creating an order, creating a plan, things like that. So, what does this look like? What should we do here? How do we facilitate this in UI? This is an example of what I think not to do. This is a tabbed approach. Now, you might be really familiar with this in a lot of other tools. Tabs are very, very, very common. The problem with tabs is that tabs kind of give you a very focused, siloed view of a specific part of the workflow. So tabs, like for instance in your browser, are really useful because you are pretty much focused on that thing. And when you're ready to go to another thing, well, you're no longer concerned about being focused on the first thing. Now, tabs are a very easy design solution because they're kind of infinitely available, right? You can add as many as you want horizontally or vertically. You can do all sorts of fancy little things like having little nested tabs so that you can show more detail, stuff like that. But the problem is that they're still siloing information from screen to screen. And one of the key selling points of this system, like I said, is that you don't have to do that. You can see all of these different pieces of information side by side. So a tabbed approach is out. That's not going to work, at least not for this view. This design is still great. I might use it for something else. We'll see. So the next option here potentially is some kind of side-by-side document viewer. This is similar to like an Obsidian theme. Obsidian is a great note taker, and there's a theme that's similar to this. And basically what it is a series of, you basically add these documents side by side. They have these little kind of columns that kind of tell you what they are. And as you add them, they kind of can collapse and fold in on themselves or collapse over other ones, and then other ones might gray out as you add these documents next to each other. And so you could conceivably add a bunch of these and then kind of have this sort of faded kind of nested approach that shows that there's more information without necessarily overwhelming you. An alternative version of this design looks something like this, where we're kind of taking our modules and making them essentially collapsible or horizontally. And this is actually a really cool idea as well. But again, we're getting into actually more of an extreme version of this problem, which is now we're hiding a lot of information that presumably the user wanted to see. We're still in a better place than tabs because we're seeing multiple modules at once, and we can probably, open and expand these really easily. And there's probably some fancy kind of logic that we could build into the front end so that the one that's pinned always is open, and then the one that's oldest is the first one to close, and things like that. But it's still a little challenging to work with, I think. It still doesn't exactly capture the essence of being able to access anything in the system at once without needing to go to a bunch of different pages. Because again, we are hiding some information here, and that I think is ultimately the problem, as is with this design, where we're now hiding information. And I think we're also failing at this parsing problem that I was addressing earlier right here, where, yeah, it's actually quite difficult to scan across this. This one less so, but this one in particular could be a little difficult to scan across because now you're hiding information. You have these kind of vertical labels that are hard to kind of parse and read at a glance, and it's just not quite as fancy, or it's not quite as clean to look at as some other options. At least with the tabs, it's pretty easy to scan across that list and see, here are all the things I can do here. Here, not so much. So what is the possible solution here? Well, I think that honestly, going back to my original idea here with these modules is probably the way to go. These modules are condensed, they're concise, and they are useful. They're not overwhelming to look at. Even when you add a couple on the page, it's not quite as overwhelming. Please forgive this this bad kind of design for the sidebar here. I could delete that, but you could see that, like, yeah, you can have a bunch here, and it's actually it feels fairly easy to kind of scan across these things. But the problem that we're going to run into with these modules is this. The begin encounter, which is essentially the next big action for the object of the appointment. That's essentially, if you were to take an object diagram, you would have an appointment, you would have begin encounter as the big action, as well as all of these other little things as objects within that diagram. So getting back to this, if we have potentially 5 or 6 of these modules, would be actually quite challenging, because now it's way off the screen and I either have to scroll back over or I have to hit a button to navigate back over. It could just be a little bit of a challenge. So what I'm thinking about is something like what I've got here, kind of, where there's maybe a bottom bar of some sort that shows the kind of primary actions for this particular primitive, or this flow, if you will. But I'm also thinking about something like this, where we kind of have this nested page situation. I think this is really interesting because of the fact that this gives us a kind of constrained working space to add these modules. Now, we don't have as much space to add modules because we now have this kind of informational sidebar within the primitive. But it's still fairly interesting to think about in that it could be a way to kind of bring some control or bring a space essentially, or constrain a space to these modules so that the actions are belonging to the appointment and not the modules themselves. This is, I think, the main issue here. Again, if this module scrolls out of the way, that begin encounter button is just gone. Now, the other thing that I think is really important to call out here is a search experience. I do think that this rightmost module should be a persistent search module. And I'll add it over here so you can kind of see what that might look like. And basically the reason I think this is important is because it provides a consistent reminder to the user that they can add more things here. They can find more things. Now, there's definitely a balance to be had here between having to click through this and type through this and do all those things and, not having to do that, right? If we just present it all. So there's definitely some level of are we creating too much friction to finding information? But I think even still, having this kind of raycast-like search experience where you can search for anything and even some actions potentially here as well, like creating a new message or an action item or something like that. I think that could be really, really valuable for a physician because now not only do they have the way to go say, hey, you can search for anything, but they also have some visual cues and indicators about what kinds of things they can search for and what kinds of things they can find. I think that there's something useful here about showing the granularity that the most recent event maybe is like the last appointment from April 12th. And they can say, oh, I could just search for last appointment and that's what's going to pop up here. That is a very powerful visual cue and indicator to the user friendliness of the system without them having to know the exact date or who the patient was with or things like that. So I think that search experience was really, particularly in this module world, is actually really, really great because honestly, in these other worlds, I don't even know where I'd put it. Yeah, you could do something where you can kind of have something float over the middle, which could be cool. Or, here it would maybe come out of this plus sign. But again, you're kind of hiding some fairly important functionality there. And I think having this search thing kind of out and floating, kind of translucent, means that it's really, really obvious what the next step here is that you can do a search for anything you need. And that's way different than most other systems on the market right now, where it might be a lot more constrained for the user. I think I'm going to stick with this design. This is honestly an interesting design exercise to go through and kind of rethink this and think about a lot of different ideas. But ultimately what I came back to was yeah, this actually probably will work. I think there's probably a world where I add some kind of floating bar down here that kind of groups this thing, or maybe kind of floats down here and has more actions and more things that can be done. Maybe that's even kind of carries through to future design, future screens, so that there's that level of consistency for the user, and it's a little bit easier to understand where they are or what they're supposed to be doing. If you have thoughts, if you have ideas, or if you have worked on things like this, I'd love to hear your take. I always love the conversations that come up in the comments off of these videos and the UX challenges that we face in the healthcare industry. This is obviously a huge lift, and this is a huge departure from other design systems. So I'm very curious to hear other thoughts and opinions and ideas inspired by this. But anyway, thank you for watching, and I will see you real soon.